New York, a chilly morning, but the air inside the convention center was hotter than any runway outside. Hundreds of young faces jostled in the vast room, each wearing their most dazzling outfits. Fabrics that shimmered, sharp, precise cuts, high-heeled shoes thumped across the gleaming wooden floor. This was not just an ordinary casting. This was the most grueling qualifying round of the year's biggest street-style fashion competition, where only a few would earn the chance to step into the limelight. Whispers echoed throughout the auditorium. Some contestants adjusted every fold of their clothes in front of mirrors. Others watched intently as the judges took their seats in the front row. The one who stood out the most was Edward Blanc, a famous and wealthy designer who always appeared in expensive suits. They said that just a nod from him could open the door of opportunity for an unknown. But a single mocking laugh could bury an entire dream. Amid that blazing atmosphere, a young man stepped forward. His name was Marcus Johnson, 17 years old, dark-skinned, tall and lean, with eyes both nervous and determined. But what drew the room's gaze was not those eyes. It was the outfit he wore, a jacket pieced together from mismatched scraps of fabric, old denim patched with frayed, worn-out cotton. His trousers followed no pattern, just bits of fabric stitched together with crude white thread. On his feet, a pair of second-hand shoes, discolored, the leather peeling away in flakes. More than a few heads turned, a few whispers hissed out. He is wearing what looks like he grabbed trash from the street. And then, amid the murmurs, Edward Blanc let out a soft, mocking snort, at first just a derisive sniff. Then he clapped once, leaned back in his chair, and spoke loud enough for the whole auditorium to hear. "That is just Rags. Who let this kid in?" Time seemed to freeze. Some contestants laughed along, grinning as though they had found a scapegoat to diffuse the tension. Others lowered their heads, silent, too afraid to speak. Marcus stood there, in the middle of hundreds of eyes. The outfit he had sewn himself, his only source of pride, was being torn apart by a single remark. The air in the room turned thick. A 17-year-old black boy, facing the mocking laughter of a powerful fashion icon. But instead of running away, Marcus clenched his fists. He took a deep breath. A spark lit in his eyes, a spark that no one in the room had noticed yet. Marcus Johnson was born and raised in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood where graffiti-covered alleys tell more stories than textbooks, where rap music blares from old speakers, drowning out car horns and the daily arguments of working-class families. Marcus's father left the family when he was too young to remember his face. All that remained was his mother, Mrs. Linda Johnson, a thin woman with rough, calloused hands from endless work. She did everything: cleaning, carrying, washing laundry for hire, everything to raise 3 children. In their cramped apartment, Marcus often had to give up a bed to his younger siblings. He slept on an old sofa, but every night he held his sketchbook close. It wasn't filled with math or literature assignments. It held sketches of clothing designs. Marcus had been passionate about fashion since he was a child. He could never afford new clothes. What he wore were either hand-me-downs or items his mother picked up from charities. But instead of being ashamed, Marcus started experimenting. He unpicked seams, restitched things his own way, added scrap patches, cut off a corner here or there, then turned them into something unique. When he was 12, Marcus discovered YouTube. There he learned how to handle needle and thread and basic pattern cutting from free videos. Without a sewing machine, he sewed by hand. Without fabric, he scavenged scraps from the local tailor shop or picked discarded clothes from the trash. Each stitch was not just joining fabric, it was a heartbeat of his own, a way to tell his story when no one would listen. At school, however, Marcus was not celebrated as an artist. On the contrary, he was often the butt of jokes. "Hey, look at the ragged kid," his classmates teased. Once, someone even ripped apart a jacket Marcus had just finished making. Right in class, he stood quietly, clutching the ripped fabric, saying nothing. But inside, Marcus vowed, if his clothes were called rags, then he would transform those rags into something that would make the world stare. To Marcus, fashion was not just playing with needle and thread. It was his escape from poverty, the only way he could preserve his dignity, and that of other kids like him, who had never had a chance to prove that a person's worth is not in the money in their wallet. And it was that dream that brought him into that casting room this morning. Standing before mocking eyes, facing Edward Blanc's scornful laughter. But behind those patchwork clothes was a patchwork life, stitched together by Marcus with resolve no force could break. Marcus's name was called. He swallowed hard and stepped onto the runway. Every step felt heavy, like hundreds of eyes were pressing down on his shoulders. In front of him, the spotlight was so bright he could barely see anything. Behind him, the whispers continued to stir. What is this kid trying to do? Just another joke. Marcus stood still at the start of the runway. His trembling hands lightly touched the raised seams of his jacket. They were not just rough stitches. They were countless sleepless nights of sewing. They were dull scissors borrowed, broken needles replaced, each time starting over with quiet patience. The host gave the signal. Marcus took a deep breath. Then he began to walk. At first, he was awkward, hesitant, but after just a few steps, something shifted. It was as if he was no longer a poor kid from Brooklyn. He became an artist, telling a story with his body. The outfit, once dismissed as rags, transformed under the lights. The mismatched fabric scraps merged into a strangely cohesive whole. The faded blue of old denim set the background for deep red, burnt yellow, and navy patches like a living street mural. The exposed white stitching, once rough and jarring, now stood out like bold patterns, proud scars. Marcus turned. His jacket swayed open with the movement, revealing a shirt underneath, recycled from an old bedsheet. But Marcus had cut and stitched it into a one-of-a-kind silhouette. Half formal, half streetwear, a fusion of two seemingly opposite worlds. He walked like he was back on the streets of Brooklyn, every step firm, deliberate, not to prove he was beautiful, but to declare, "This is me, this is where I come from, and this is the dream I carry." The room felt completely silent. The earlier snickers dissolved. People no longer saw a kid in rags. They saw an idea, a statement. Each judge's expression shifted. One tilted their head to study the garment construction more closely. Another muttered, "This boy knows how to match colors." And then, suddenly, a round of applause broke the silence. It started with one female judge. Then others followed. Even the audience, cold and detached just moments before, began to rise and cheer for the 17-year-old black boy in so-called rags. Marcus stopped at the end of the runway. He did not bow like the other models. He simply held his head high, eyes shining, as if to say, "I am here, and I belong." In that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because everyone realized what Marcus had brought was not just clothing. It was living art, a soul that could turn what the world threw away into symbols of hope and pride. The applause still echoed through the hall. Marcus stood there, breathing heavily but with eyes burning bright. He had just turned so-called rags into something no one could look away from. But then, cutting through the applause, a cold voice rang out. "This is not fashion, this is garbage." It was Edward Blanc. He did not clap, he did not smile. He leaned back in his seat, eyes filled with contempt. The room fell silent again. It was like a bucket of ice water had just been thrown over the crowd. Some contestants smirked, thinking Marcus was about to be crushed once more. Marcus clenched his fists. In that moment, memories came flooding back, being mocked as the kid in rags, watching his mother work herself to exhaustion. If he stayed silent, he would be trampled again. But if he spoke up, this might be his only chance to prove his worth. He raised his head, looked directly at Edward, and said, voice low and firm, "Garbage, maybe, but where I come from, we turn garbage into hope." A murmur rippled through the room. Just one sentence, but it struck deep in the hearts of those who heard it. Edward frowned, about to respond, but before he could, one of the judges rose to her feet. It was Angela Moore, the renowned black designer and symbol of resilience in the fashion world. Angela walked to the center of the room. Her voice rang out, calm but piercing. "Do you know, I once stood exactly where this young man stands. Years ago, I was cut from a competition too. Why? Because I was poor. Because my clothes were not designer labels. Because they called me the girl in rags." The room held its breath. No one had expected someone as powerful as Angela to have lived through the same experience. She turned to Marcus, eyes glistening. "But I did not give up. I turned humiliation into motivation. And today, I see in you the reflection of my younger self. Marcus felt a lump in his throat, but he stood firm. In that moment, he was no longer just a lonely teenager. He had someone ahead of him, an icon, standing up to validate his dream. The room erupted. Applause thundered again, louder than before, this time not just for the performance, but for the story behind it. People began to whisper, "This kid is really something." Yes, this is what fashion is, telling your own story. Edward Blanc sat in silence, his face tight. He had not expected one insult to become the very spark that made Marcus shine even brighter. Meanwhile, Marcus stood still, chest rising and falling, eyes unwavering. He no longer trembled like when he first walked in, because now, everyone in the room knew. Marcus did not just bring an outfit, he brought a truth, but truth no one could deny. Talent does not care about skin color, background, or the weight of your wallet. The tension in the hall was as tight as a pulled string. All eyes were locked on the judge's table. Everyone knew the moment of truth had arrived. One male judge, known for being notoriously strict, was the first to speak. This young man did not just walk the runway, he walked his life story and turned it into art. Another judge nodded, voice clear and certain. I have never seen creativity turn throwaways into such a powerful statement. The room burst into sounds of agreement. Some people stood and clapped. Others began chanting Marcus's name. But there was one person who did not smile, Edward Blanc. He shot to his feet and slammed a hand on the table. This is a joke. Are you all seriously turning a kid in rags into a star? Fashion is about refinement, about elegance, not this cheap trash. But this time, no one backed him. Instead, the audience booed. Some of the other contestants turned toward him with clear disapproval in their eyes. Angela Moore stepped forward and looked him straight in the eye. You are wrong, Edward. Fashion is not just for the wealthy. It is the voice of our time, the people. And today, that voice belongs to Marcus Johnson. Edward stood frozen, his face drained of color. He realized his authority had just been challenged in front of hundreds of witnesses. Then, the host stepped forward with the envelope. The entire hall held its breath. The microphone crackled, then rang out clearly. The official result of the casting round. The contestant who received a perfect score from the judges is Marcus Johnson. The room exploded. Cheers filled the air. Some people leapt from their seats. Others clapped until their hands turned red. Marcus stood frozen. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. But then he looked down and saw his mother, Linda, sobbing in the audience. He rushed forward and threw his arms around her. The two held each other tight. Their tears were not from sadness, but from a dream beginning to come true. The host continued, and that is not all. Marcus will also receive a special opportunity, a collaboration with a major fashion label to develop his own collection. Inspired by today's design, another wave of applause swept the room. Meanwhile, Edward Blanc quietly gathered his papers. No one looked his way anymore. There were no triumphant laughs echoing his earlier ridicule. He lowered his head and walked out silently, swallowed by the roar of celebration for Marcus. On stage stood a 17-year-old black boy, once mocked as the kid in rags, now basking in the spotlight, not just wearing recycled clothes, but standing tall with belief, pride, and a brand new path opening before him. That victory was only the beginning. Marcus Johnson, the 17-year-old black teen once mocked for wearing rags, suddenly became a name on every fashion magazine's front page. A photo of him on the runway, in that recycled outfit, eyes steady, graced the cover of New York's biggest streetwear magazine. The headline, printed in bold, "From Rags to Runway." Social media exploded. Thousands of comments flooded in. This kid made me believe I can do it too. This is the real definition of creativity. Marcus, thank you for giving us hope. Marcus began receiving letters and messages from young people everywhere. Some shared stories of dropping out of school because of poverty. Others admitted they were mocked for dressing differently. But all of them had one thing in common. Marcus's story had reignited a spark within them. Gradually, a movement began. People started calling it "From Rags to Runway." It encouraged young people to reuse scraps, old clothes, even waste materials, to create one-of-a-kind designs. No need for lavish spending, just ideas, hands, and persistence. In Brooklyn, where Marcus grew up, small tailor shops began collecting leftover fabric to give away free to underprivileged youth. Schools launched sewing clubs, drawing inspiration from Marcus. On social media, the hashtag from rags to runway became a trend, spreading far beyond New York to Los Angeles, London, even reaching Africa. And Marcus, once the kid in rags, became the face of the movement. He never forgot where he came from. Every time he had a chance to speak, he would say, "This is not just about fashion. This is how we turn pain into power. It is how we prove that a person's worth is never in the clothes they wear, but in the heart and will inside." The image of that 17-year-old boy hugging his mother on the day of his victory was retold over and over. But even more powerful was how Marcus's resilience turned one personal moment into a blazing movement, lighting the way for thousands of young Black youth around the world. The story of Marcus Johnson is not just about an outfit, not just about a fashion competition. It is the story of a young Black man who dared to stand tall, who dared to face contempt, and prove that a person's value is never in the money in their wallet or the label on their shirt. Marcus turned discarded fabric into a dream, and that dream, today, no longer belongs to just him. It belongs to everyone who has ever been looked down upon, ever been called different, ever felt like they did not belong. The final message is clear. Never let anyone define your worth by your clothes, your background, or your money. It is you, with passion and determination, who decides the path you walk. If this story touched you, help it reach even further. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling more inspiring journeys. Because who knows, the next story the world needs to hear might just be yours.